Yarana everyone, welcome to this new episode of our podcast, newly named Pacific Talks, a conversation on the future of the Pacific, where I talk to leaders from the Pacific or around the world to have a look at the current challenges the Pacific is facing or will face in the future. And today I'm very happy to welcome on the show Andre Afamasaga, who's joining us from New Zealand. Andre is a human rights advocate who's currently working for the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. Before that, he was a Christian pastor, and in the end of 2019, Andre got on the news after publishing an opinion piece titled "Gay Christian and a Former Preacher, I'm Coming Out to Help Anyone Hurt by Fallout," following some public declarations made by the rugby player Israel Folau. But more on that later. So without further ado, let's start this conversation to share his views on different challenges that can impact the Pacific today and in the future. Andre, Yarana.
Yorana, bonjour, talofa lava. My name's Andre Afamasaga, and as you said, I'm here in Wellington, New Zealand, although I'm also of Samoan heritage as well.
All right, thank you and welcome on the show. So, Andre, first and foremost, for our audience who may not already know you, can you tell us who you are and what was your life path and up until now, knowing that we'll talk more in detail afterwards about what happened since the end of 2019?
Awesome. Well, I'm Samoan. I was born and raised in New Zealand. I grew up in a traditional Samoan home, which meant that it was quite conservative, traditional Samoan values, and also very Christian as well. So I had a normal sort of upbringing in childhood in New Zealand. For someone that's Pacific, my parents came here, decades ago to try to forge a better future for themselves and also for a future family. And so I have a typical story of a migrant, of a Pacific migrant to New Zealand and also to Australia as well. So I grew up, Christian values and education was super important. So I have that in common with a lot of Pacific people in my part of the world. Along the line, I became a committed Christian, but I always knew that I was gay. And when I became a committed Christian and also gave my life to Jesus, I kind of, soon learned that was incompatible, I suppose, of Christian teachings that of being homosexual and also being Christian as well. So I basically suppressed my sexuality. I didn't tell. I wasn't hiding my sexuality, but I was trying not to be gay. And so using the church and teachings and things called conversion therapy practices, I tried to become straight, and I eventually became a pastor as well. And then along the line, I got to a certain age, and I just thought, after trying to be straight for many years, and that not working for me, I decided that I needed to be true to myself as gay, and then I decided to stop being a pastor, and I eventually came out publicly at the end of 2019.
All right. And so this coming out was not only just for your family, but was a public coming out because you made this opinion piece in an Australian newspaper. And this happened in the midst of the Israel Folau scandal. So can you tell us a little bit about this context and why did you decide to come out and to do this in the midst of this situation?
Sure. So I sort of started coming out to myself and my family and my close friends. And I always thought, because in my denomination, I was kind of well known as a pastor, that eventually I knew that I was going to have to come out to more than just my family and friends, because I knew the news was going to get around. And to be honest, I didn't want people gossiping about me. I thought at least if people were gossiping about me, that they would at least have the facts from me. But around that same time, and then I became employed at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. So, and by the way, this interview that I'm conducting today, these are my personal views, not the views of the Commission necessarily, although the Human Rights Commission obviously supports, gay rights and rainbow rights, obviously, but my views are my own today. But I suppose working in human rights, been my own coming out to myself and to my family. And then in 2018, but then again in 2019, when I go on social media after the rugby star Israel Folau, the whole debacle of where he posted a sort of a Christian meme and a Bible verse saying that homosexuals will go to hell along with lots of other so-called sinners. And when I'd gone to Facebook, to be honest, I was just becoming quite annoyed and actually quite saddened by the discussion or type of discussion or the quality of discussion that I'd see when I'd go into Facebook and social media. And many Christians would be espousing homophobic views. And I just knew that if you were gay and if you were rainbow and if you were Pacific, that you were seeing your loved ones, including church leaders and family members, speaking of homosexuality and speaking of rainbow people in the most negative way. And I really started to worry about the mental health impacts and well-being of young or rainbow people who are Pacific, but especially those who are young. And I actually thought, whether Israel knew it or not, and I don't think he really knew it, I think he's just a product of his environment. But what I could see happening is that another generation of Pacific people being forced back into the closet and feeling less safe to become themselves. That's one thing, but when I think the church then supports that and reinforces that, I feel that's a real issue, because I feel like the church should be a safe place for all, and that shouldn't necessarily become so politicized and involved in these types of debates. And I thought as a former pastor that the church has got to be an accepting and safe place for all people, particularly those that aren't accepted by, mainstream society. So when I started seeing all that stuff, I think I got annoyed because I thought that's not how the church should be. And that's why I thought it was important for me to come out to share another side of the story and also to humanize this debate that had become very political, very theological, and unbalanced in my view.
All right, thanks. And obviously coming out publicly like this made you kind of an ambassador or a leader for the cause of gay rights in the Pacific. And because this conversation turns around leadership and how leaders like you can help the region move forward in the future. Before we move forward, can you tell us what is your definition of leadership?
Yeah. Awesome. It's so funny that you describe me in that way. That's certainly not the way that I describe myself, like in terms of, being a leader in this area. But I do think, to me, it's how I would view a leader as well. I think those that are looking to be leaders per se, sometimes, in my opinion, the leaders that I respect the most are those ones that aren't necessarily looking to be leaders, but rather have a cause or an issue that they feel so strongly about that their life really just gets behind that whole sort of ethos and that whole belief. So for me, leaders aren't necessarily those that call themselves leaders or even people that we call leaders, but rather those that are just living their lives and living it in a really integrated way, So for me, it's less about what you say in public. That's important, but also it's the way that you live your life, the example, the way that you treat people. Are you helping people? Is your actions backing up the rhetoric and the public rhetoric? There's been many times I've met leaders in real life, and I know I can be like this because I used to be a pastor and I used to speak a lot. And sometimes in my mind I would think, oh my gosh, you were better on the stage. Like the more learning about you, like the more disheartened I'm becoming, So I certainly think for me, like in my opinion, the leaders that I admire the most are not necessarily those that are making the loudest noise in terms of their words, but rather, the impact they're having on people's lives. So, and I think Pacific leadership, Christian leadership, those things are really important as well, is that we are backing up, I suppose, our words with the ethos, and also, by the value add that we are bringing to people's lives, and particularly helping those that sometimes don't have a platform to speak for themselves because people aren't listening to them.
Do you think it's also coming with the accepting the fact that when you come out like this, when you take a stand on your values, on the situation, it comes with the risk of being attacked, like being fragile maybe in the open? Do you think it's important in the way that you show the example to show also your sensibility? And how did you deal with this when it happened to you?
Yeah, that's a really good point. To be honest, I was expecting the pushback. And I think when I was a pastor, my question always was, because I know that the church can be perceived as being really judgmental and being like a club where a lot of people aren't allowed. So when I was a pastor, I was always asking that question, who's not in this church and why not? The irony is that I hadn't accepted myself, but I was certainly trying to make my own local churches accepting of other people. I just wasn't able to apply my belief that I had for others to me when it came to my sexuality. I think I was always used to sort of like sticking up and speaking up for people in my church, or that I suppose those who were Christians didn't think we were sort of acceptable to church. So I was always happy to carry that responsibility for others. So when I came out publicly, I thought I was going to have some backlash. I don't think what I was ready for was actually lots of acceptance as well. So many people, and I wasn't expecting this, I was expecting just a lot of negativity. And I got so much support from all around the world where people were saying, that is my story as well. I so relate to that. Or people would say to me, my gosh, if the church or Christians lived out what you were saying in that article, I could actually come to church, So there was a really lot of positive support as well. I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was that I heard from a university chaplain at a university, and they said to me, at a secular university, and they said to me, I wish this article had come out a couple of months ago. We had a couple of students, Pacific students, who were suicided to this issue. And they just thought that if this type of discussion, if this type of visibility was, present maybe even a couple of months earlier, it might give people different alternatives in terms of that you could be gay, you could be Christian, and you could be Pacific, So I feel like any fear of rejection or criticism was outweighed by what I wanted to do, and I wanted to help people. And I think that's, in this way, while not being a pastor for the church, I feel like good leaders and good pastors are always helping people anyway, because it's not about us.
Right. And you mentioned a little bit earlier that the leaders in the Pacific region are very influenced by religion and mostly Christianity. So how do you think our current leaders throughout the region are dealing with the influence of religion in their decision making while facing challenges that are quite new for everyone?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I think is really important is that I think it's important for Pacific leaders to. One of the things I always like to say is that the missionization and the colonization of the South Pacific is so successful. That campaign from the colonial powers is so successful that today, when you look at the Christian church across the Pacific, and I'm talking about Australia and New Zealand as well, a large part of that makeup is from Pacific people. So we have well and truly taken on board and adopted and lived out like what the missionaries first our shores so long ago. But I also like to say as well is that when our ancestors were receiving the missionaries and the effects of colonization, that they weren't passive agents in that process. And I kind of feel like they were always negotiating according to their own self-interest, like what elements of the Bible, what elements of colonization would work for them. So whether that was the appeal of egalitarianism or whether it was the appeal of familiar hierarchical structures, I feel as if when they were receiving that, it was resonating with what was already existing with them. So that's all to say that from the beginning, we have not been passive agents in our version of Christianity. And so to me, I kind of feel like Pacific leaders have a really important role in terms of shaping what Christianity looks like in this side of the world, our own flavor of Christianity, I suppose. rather than sort of adopting just wholesale, I suppose, these Western values. I think we have a really awesome opportunity to shape our own brand of Christianity that's far more inclusive. So we don't do it in a lot of places. We do it in some places, and a lot of it's by self-interest. And all I'm saying is that because of your love for rainbow family members, that actually we can reinterpret and we can have a more inclusive conversation about who's being left in and who's not, you know. So, for instance, in some denominations across the Pacific, you know, Whawhawhinge and, you know, other island versions, they're able to worship in some of those denominations, because I think people have, you know, sort of figured out that these are our family members who we love, so they have a place. I kind of feel like the more your denomination, though, is influenced by Western denominational values or histories, that the less likely you are to do that. And I want to say to us that we are not passive agents. Rather, we are, you know, we put family first. We say we love people, we love our families, we love our communities, and we love God. Therefore, that we need to really prioritize the needs of our rainbow community who are suffering, actually.
Interesting. And that reminds me of a quote that from you on an interview last year, where you said churches mostly espouse the traditional biblical interpretation on homosexuality. Unfortunately, it means that people like me are on the outside of that. But as you said, traditionally, there are those people like the Whawhawhine or the Rere in Tahiti that used to be allowed in the society, had a precise role in society, and were quite accepted. So do you think the collide between tradition and Christianity at some point made this conflict between identities in the Pacific, where we let some elements of the tradition go and we reinforced others, like the notion of the male, the warrior, and all that may be reaffirmed by the image of the man in Christianity? And how do you think all this is mixed up together today, and how to deal with this on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think that's really good questions. I think fundamentally, when it comes to Christianity, even when it comes to leadership, when it comes to all the systems that we currently live and operate by in the Pacific, I do believe there's a real need to decolonize those systems, to actually look at what has been imported in terms of colonization, in terms of Western thought, and let's decolonize those and let's pick and choose what's working for us, you know. And when I think what makes a good Pacific leader, I think of a leader that is looking for the welfare and the well-being of the entire community, not just some people, not just the privileged. Because if you live as the diaspora, as I do in New Zealand, have lived in Australia, you will know well that the Pacific people within these countries are some of the most marginalized people as a large cohort. You know, so we experience and suffer from some of the worst social disadvantage and outcome. Therefore, if you're a rainbow person within already a marginalized community, your marginalization is, you know, further increased and impacted. Who is going to be speaking up for us? You know, who is going to have a voice for us? Who is going to protect us in light of the fact that we face discrimination just because of the color of our skin and our ethnicity in these countries in which we live? And I would say a good leader, good community leaders are looking to protect the most vulnerable within their communities, understanding that we all experience this. So if I can go back to just decolonizing our beliefs, including our religion, I think we need to really assess, like, what have we taken on board that's very Western that is actually marginalizing some of our community members? When I look at where Whawhawhinge fits into society, I would say that, you know, within the rainbow cohort, that obviously trans people have their worst forms of discrimination all around the world, and even in the Pacific, despite the acceptance of Whawhawhinge as well. But I will say this, that I think Whawhawhinge is more understood in a Pacific context because it fits the heteronormative roles within society. So, for instance, Whawhawhinge and Whawhakama, which is the male equivalent, it fits in well to the collective family structure, of Samoan. So, for instance, if you're a whawhawhinge and you still are expected to provide for the family, you are still expected to play the role of a female in a heteronormative understanding, because it's all around the family, centered around what works for the family. So I think that's why there is place for whawhawhinge, but there is not necessarily understanding of someone like me, for instance. And I have privilege as a cis gay male, but I do think it makes no functional sense in a Samoan Pacific understanding that, like, okay, so I like another male, I'm attracted, and that's, but I don't think that necessarily serves the family, like in terms of how does this serve the family unit? And so I think that's why there is the acceptance, at least, of the whawhawhinge. But I must say that I'm not whawhawhinge, so I can't speak for this community. But I think when we're decolonising and picking apart what works for us, we need to get to something that works for everyone. Yeah.
So would you say that?
I kind of feel like it was a bit confusing. Apologies.
No, it's super interesting, and I wonder if you think that actually colonization through religion, because indeed that's mostly where it started, brought some kind of rigidity in the social construct of the Pacific communities, whereas before they had like a more like flexibility or more fluidity that was allowing every type of identity to find their role and their place in the society. And eventually now we had to answer to a more binary vision of the world.
Absolutely. Yes to everything you've said. I think what we often do in Pacific cultures, and I'm just going to speak generally now across all the cultures, is that we do tend to romanticize and we mythologize in terms of, some of the values and some of the practices that we have today. And we romanticize them to the point that we cannot touch them. We don't know where they started. Did they start with colonization? Did they start with the church? It actually doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter, but they've become so untouchable that to even question them or to even raise it as an issue is seen as an affront to those institutions, like of culture and also religion as well. So I agree with you. I think what we need to do, though, is have honest conversations around how did we get here? And again, I think one of the important things in this conversation is it working for everyone? There's a group within our societies and in our cultures that cannot be themselves, that are experiencing discrimination and unfairness and not able to, if we're having, rates of mental health and well-being and even suicide that are higher than the norm, we need to really think about this is not working for everyone. And it doesn't, and we need to then unpack and have the bravery to unpack those romanticized notions, of what is culture, what is Christianity, what does it mean to be Pacific.
Interesting. What's also questioning me is the fact that so colonization brought this binary, rigid views of societies, but now thanks to the internet or because of the internet, we are going back to another kind of fluidity where basically everyone can be whoever they want because you can find a community that fits your views of the world or your identity. So we're talking more and more now a spectrum of identities. You can be gay, you can be trans, you can be queer, you can be basically whatever you want and find people who resonate with you on that. How do you think that is impacting the Pacific communities now? Because not only the Pacific, but also in other parts of the world, we hear a lot of people saying, oh, this is not our tradition, this is not our culture, those identities are imported. Yet we go back to what we were just talking about. So it's like all messing up on that. And how do you think our leaders should cope with that? And mostly, how should we educate them on those problems?
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I think there's probably, I'm just making this framework up in my mind, but I think there's some principles by which we need to test those types of ideas. I think number one, we need a good scientific evidence base in terms of research, So for instance, when we're talking about different identities, sexual orientations, expressions, gender fluidity, whatever, I think the science really needs to inform our discussion. Even in the Pacific, it needs to, because otherwise this conversation can easily turn to opinions, and it can really easily it's mostly dominated by fear-based narratives. People fearing that, tradition, culture, religion is being compromised or under threat or being persecuted. So I think, I think evidence. So the science is really important in terms of the gender issue. I think the other issue is let's have some good historical, cultural discussions as well. And what I mean by that is not being afraid to unpack those romantic notions that we have held onto. And as you just gave that example so well, like we keep talking about, gender fluidity, different gender identities as a threat to us. But actually, if we go back into our history, we will see actually that's what we emerged from. So it's having someone like to say, hey, this is what, the history shows, and this is what our culture shows as well. So someone to have those types of conversations as well, and to lift the veil and say, like, these are not new ideas. These have happened before, And I think the other important one that keeps coming back, and I keep calling it a people-centered approach or an ethical people-centered approach, is what we are believing. Is that working for everyone? So let's not just talk about what your opinion of it is and what you think should work. Are these constructs, does it work for everyone? And I think we've really got to, hear people's stories more. I think we've got to listen more. And I think, I really appreciate being on your podcast today. I think as you allow people of different diversity, different backgrounds, people that fit the intersection of someone like me, who happen to be rainbow, happen to be Christian, and I also happen to be Pacific, that as we get to hear these more nuanced accounts, we can have a better quality of discussion, and it's less centered around fear-based narratives about the what if and people's opinions, and actually based on actually what happens for people, And I think that actually requires our communities to resist vanity, so-called cultural purity, to imagine that things were always amazing once, I don't mean to get negative, but I kind of feel like we have this really high standard of sexual ethical purity within Pacific religious cultures. And yet, if you've lived any time in the Pacific, you will know that there's a lot of family sexual violence that occurs regularly, You will know there's things like, despite us going to church all the time, you'll also know there's high rates of teenage pregnancy and pregnancy outside of marriage. So I'm not trying to shame people at all. I'm just trying to say, and I don't think it's a bad thing to be pregnant, by the way, at all. I'm just trying to say that despite our rhetoric and these standards that are impossibly high, the evidence and the data and the research will show that none of us can actually live up to these very standards. So do we continue to bang the drum louder and continue to say the standard is up here and everyone is failing it? Or do we actually take a look at the reality and actually say, hey, in the process of this reality over here, we are judging a whole bunch of people, we're excluding a whole bunch of people, we're making people feel really bad about themselves to the point that their mental health and well-being is being compromised, and also to the point that some people might have suicidal thoughts. Are we going to live with that, or are we actually going to change our religion and our culture, which should be people-centered and centered around love, to make it work better for everyone, So I think those are the types of things that I think are really important, and need to happen.
That goes back to your definition of leadership, where it's not about what you say, but what you do, the example that you show. But you also think it would require at some point a more horizontal type of leadership where you can offer a space for everyone to speak up, to tell their views, their perspective, and then goes like lower down the very vertical, somehow called traditional leadership that we can see in our communities.
Absolutely. And this is the other thing about leadership, and I think particularly where Christians have missed the boat, the typical Christian leader has missed the boat. But actually, if you look at the example of Jesus, it's just hilarious to me because he was actually just about sacrifice and about other people. I mean, so, Jesus, as we know, died on the cross. So there's this whole element of leadership coming with a cost and with a sacrifice as well. And yet, in order for us to have these conversations and to make it safer for people, everyone, it will come at a cost to leaders. And that cost is the release of power. It's also the release of holding all of this knowledge that favors and privileges, the elites, and it's actually about being open and actually saying that, hey, the system that works well for me and these things that have made me popular in terms of fear-based rhetoric, whatever, that the sacrifice is that I'm going to lose all of that, that popularity. I'm going to lose people feeling safe, because sometimes people feel safe when we espouse, these fear-based narratives. So anyway, this is all to say that Christian leaders should be the ones that are really leading the charge in terms of, accepting that cost to ourselves because of other people. So if we look that other people are suffering and experiencing marginalization, and I have a platform by which I can help them by bringing education and understanding, despite getting some criticism and falling out of favor with the powers that be, well, if someone can do it and if someone should do it, it should be us. I may be idealistic, but I kind of feel like that's the difference that Christian leadership and Pacific leadership should bring. Like if there's a differentiation that we bring to leadership as a whole, to the body of leadership and the example of leadership, I kind of feel like that's what we should bring, that people-centered approach, and the sacrifice.
Interesting. And do you think that the digital tools, the technology could be helpful in that regards to spread the message, a more positive message, a more pacific message, as you said, even though kind of everything that started for you was because of the spread of violence and calls on internet eventually?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just get really comforted. I know that my story, many other people's stories are out there. And I think if you are a closeted, scared Christian or a young rainbow person somewhere in the world, and you can read stories, you can watch videos now, that give you hope and let you know that you're not alone. I just love that, Obviously, as you've alluded to, there's also lots of, immature discourse out there, a lot of fear-based rhetoric, a lot of fake news out there as well. And again, this is where I think it's really important for leaders to be ethical, to be to not spread news that is fake news, to not spread ideas that are based on fear. I think good leaders are about spreading hope and building bridges. Not making people feel more scared than they are. I kind of feel like whether you're a Christian leader or a leader, your job is to inspire and to bring hope and to bring solutions, not just to call out all the bad things. I'll just give you an example. Maybe 3 weeks ago, I had an article ready to go that I was going to write on, the Capitol Hill riots. And the article was really about, it was so disturbing to me when I saw those images and you would see Jesus Save flags next to white supremacists. And I thought, gosh, what is this? That there is this comfortable association that no one is calling out, And so anyway, I got really passionate about that. And I had an article that was about to be published. And at the last minute, based on the advice of a family member, and then also my own thinking and praying, I actually pulled back from publishing the article because I feel like I made a lot of good points in terms of that we shouldn't have this association between racism, white supremacy, and nationalism and Christianity. Like, how do these things fit together? They should not fit together. I feel like I made a lot of good points in that article, but I also felt like I had a responsibility to build a bridge as well. And I think in the article at that particular time, I was highlighting a lot of the issues, but I wasn't building the bridges enough. And I thought I had a responsibility to at least propose some positive solutions and also to allow people to engage in a respectful discussion after that type of article come out. And I think in the type of age we live in with the, prevalence of fake news, etc., and a lot of divisive discourse, there's also a lot of people just calling things out. And I think what happens is that's not necessarily helpful as well, because what it can do is preclude a really mature and a respectful discussion and also an understanding of each other's ideas and where people are coming from. So I think that's an important responsibility of leaders as well, to propose solutions and to model the very things that they were talking about. So in that case, like I felt like I had to pull the article because I could trumpet and say all the things that were wrong, but if I wanted to model it, that was really missing from the article at the time.
Interesting. That tees up perfectly with my next question. I wanna take a step back and look at a more global approach of what we're living right now. So we have the discussion on minority rights, whether sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, even women. We have a lot of resistance against the movements that are pleading for the rights of these people, but we also have a lot of resistance against climate change, which we are experiencing firsthand in the Pacific. We have resistance against migrants. We have resistance against science now, and Samoa, unfortunately, experienced that last year in 2019 with the measles that was caused by anti-vax movements. So everything seems to go the wrong way sometimes when you look at what's happening in the world, and all those bridges that you're talking about seems to be burned by leaders more than built. So do you think there has been a failure globally in leadership, or is it a deeper problem in our societies that will require other ways of thinking? Because when you hear people say, "Oh, I have to be politically correct and I can't say anything," you're like, no, it's just common sense to not hurt other people's feelings. Yet it seems something that's very common to hear. So where do you think is the cause of all those big divisions in our communities globally?
Yeah, no, I think, oh my gosh, I don't have the answer, obviously.
I wish you had.
No. I think you articulated those issues so well. And I really feel, again, it's really contingent on leaders to actually to lead a really informed discussion. And when I say informed, like we've talked about science, what does the evidence say? It just can't be people's personal opinions. We've got to really just watch up, what does the evidence say? What does the science say? And again, what are the harms being caused, in this situation? Where are people's lives affected? I feel like leaders need to take the time and the energy to research deeply. And when I say research deeply, I'm not talking about going to YouTube. I'm talking about not sitting in your echo chamber. I'm talking about, crossing the aisle and actually finding out what people are thinking on the other side. But I think you have to be very careful in terms of when you're trying to build the understanding that you do have a leadership voice, and in today's society, unfortunately, there's a lot of really negative voices out there as well. So I feel like we need to be building understanding and building bridges, but that also gets to the point where you cannot repeat voices that are negative and are harmful just because, I feel looking at, again, you have to look at who's been harmed. And like, for instance, the measles situation, like in terms of trying to understand what's happening on the other side, you don't have to repeat information that's actually going to possibly kill people, or put them at great risk in terms of their health. So I feel like there needs to be, a real a balance in how we do this. I do feel, though, that church leaders who are before their congregations every week in a formal sense with the sermon or the liturgy, and then influence their church members throughout the week, that they should really take more care in terms of the messages that are coming from the platform. It cannot just be what you are hearing in your echo chamber, watching from, your version of whatever's happening on YouTube, and this is where I would say it's time to pass the mic. I feel like church leaders and churches have this incredible platform to do good and to spread good. And I've always subscribed to the belief that if it's good, God's in it, And that means that even passing the mic to people that are outside of the church, is there a scientist, for instance, outside of the church, or a clinician, a health clinician that can help my people? I'm not a doctor, I'm not a clinician, but there's a qualified, great doctor here who's gone to school for so many years, worked in the hospital. Invite them into the church, ask them what their views are, based on good experience, based on research, everything else. I also think it's really important in all of these debates that we have, and they're across so many areas, that we need an inclusive discussion. It always makes me laugh in the church where a whole bunch of church leaders, church men, are debating the role of women, On YouTube, it cracks me up. And they're talking about what will work for women, and they're men, Similarly, we have a whole bunch of cis, straight males discussing gay rights. I just think that's the weirdest thing, when we're debating all of these issues. Similarly as well to a whole bunch of white people debating racism. I'm like, listen, it doesn't mean that these groups that fit outside these minority groups can't have an opinion or a view, but they need to be informed views, and they should be informed by lived experience, And I kind of feel like good leaders, good church leaders are thinking less of protecting their own reputations and wanting to look right and be informed on every single subject, and rather like just passing the mic to someone that knows it a lot better, and actually modelling what learning looks like and modelling that posture of humility. And that way, our church members can learn as well, like in terms of, we don't know about a subject. Okay, well, rather than jump into YouTube about that, like, let's see what the science says, and also let's talk to someone who lives and walks in that world.
Yeah. Do you think the new generations are more equipped for this kind of approach than the elders?
Absolutely, I do think so. I think, social media, and I think just being brought up by a different generation of parents, gives them, a more confident, a bolder voice. But I caution, though, in saying that that there needs to be a variety of approaches to advocacy and to bringing change, and it just cannot be calling people out. There's a place for that, absolutely, but there needs to be a nuanced approach. Just as we can't romanticize the past, we can't also vilify the past as well. Can't always just be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I think there needs to be a blending of approaches, and also it can't just fall on one person or one approach. I think there needs to be a multiplicity and a variety of different approaches. I think when you're, some people ask me, why am I still a Christian? Why am I still in the church? Despite not being accepted in my denomination because I'm gay. And by the way, I'm Seventh-day Adventist. That's my background. I know there's a lot of Seventh-day Adventists, across French Polynesia and Tahiti as well. And the reason I'm still there is because it's just part of my socialization. That's the way I was raised. I spent a lot of weekends at church. It's part of who I am. When I wake up in the morning, I pray. I read the Bible when I struggle, when I need help. I need that spiritual guidance. So that's why I'm still here. So just as I'm not throwing out the baby with the bathwater and painting all Christians as bad, when we're doing our approaches, we can't have those broad stroke approaches. I do feel, though, as a former pastor, I do kind of like I do actually like to place a bit more onus on the church and church leaders, because I was one myself. And also I feel like they have such an important and influential voice in this issue where so many people are suffering unnecessarily. With the help of the church and with the help of leaders, we can alleviate suffering, and we can actually bring understanding and remove some of the fear. So even though I say it's important not to broad brush stroke, I do feel like leaders should be held to a different account. That's actually a Christian principle, by the way, where we say that leaders and teachers are held to a different account because we enjoy the benefits of the platform as well. And because we do, that we should actually do the important work and the sacrifices that come with that.
Some thanks. Okay, at this stage of the podcast, what I usually like to do is to quote an author, a book, and try to have two great thinkers collide their ideas through a quote. And for this one, I chose the book Far and Away from the writer and psychologist Andrew Solomon, that you may know about. And so that's an account of all these travels and personal reflections. And he writes this: while I was good at fitting in under anomalous circumstances, I had to acknowledge my differences and accept that others noticed them too. You can't fit in with people by pretending to be just like they are. You fit in by engaging in a dialogue about your differences and by putting aside the assumption that your way of life is in any way preferable to theirs. So in this context of your closely tied island communities, what do you think of this quote?
I'm sorry, in the context of what, sorry?
Of our very tight communities in the island.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
How easy do you think it can be to be yourself when you depend so hardly on other people and the strength of the bounds of the community are so important?
That's right. Yeah. Nice. Thank you. I think this is where leadership plays a really big role. Because I always feel like the onus and the responsibility falls on leaders, Christian leaders, shepherds. That's a Bible analogy in terms of shepherd looking out for sheep. I kind of feel like the good leaders are looking out for all of their people. And so I feel like I know when I was a pastor, when I was young, just to give you a bit of background, is that my mum would always say to my sister and I, the person or the children that have no friends at school, that needs to be your best friend. And I thought, that's weird. But basically she said that when we'd go to school and if we'd see people by themselves, that she said that we had a responsibility to make friends with them. So anyway, that was just something that always stuck out to me, Unfortunately, when I became a teenager, I then found out that person was actually me because I had no friends, So, but I think by the time I became a pastor and because of those experiences of feeling on the outside, I was always asking, who is not at this church and why not? Who are the people that are currently excluded? Who are people in our church that do not have a voice? So who are the people in our church but are marginalized? So I always feel like that's a really good quality of a leader, to be looking out for everyone. So I actually think this is very practical. And so therefore, rather than asking the question of that person, like, why aren't you fitting in and what do you need to do to change so you can fit in, I feel actually the ownership and the onus is on the leaders to actually say, why isn't this working for everyone? So instead of asking what can individuals do to fit in, my question is more, how can leaders make sure that the system and the organization is working for everyone? And I feel like if you get it right for those who have the least agency, the least power, that it actually makes favorable conditions for everyone. So that's a really long way of answering your question. It's what I always like to do in terms of putting the onus on leaders, because we have power to influence change. And if I can just be a little bit critical now, I kind of feel like in the Pacific model, it's not enough for pastors just to go up and do sermons, but they're not why people are pastors. I feel the essence of being a pastor, the essence of being a really good leader is to help people. And I feel that's our mission. And I feel like in a Pacific context, if you have forgotten what your mission is, and that is to follow the example of Jesus to help people, particularly those that have been rejected and marginalized by society, then you have forgotten your true calling. And I think that's very, very sad. So I do hope that, I do hope that a new generation or a different brand of leader will emerge. But I also hope that our Pacific communities allow for that new type of leader to emerge, that we give them permission to push us and permission to help us unpack what I keep calling those romantic notions, help us to decolonize our understanding of culture and of the Bible, because sometimes, again, it's these systems that people want. We want to feel safe. And these systems us feel safe, but not everyone's safe.
Yeah, and that's always the hard equation for a leader, is to maintain the safety of his community while pushing them forward to good and necessary change. And it's always difficult. All right. Yes. Thanks, Andre. I'll just have one more question for you. I could pick your brain for longer, but we're constrained by time. So a very easy question. What would be your advice or recommendation to any person who would like to become an agent of change for his or her community and may feel helpless for now in the world that we live?
Yeah. I just think start where you are, look around. I think as a Christian leader, one of the things I would say is, like, if you're looking in your community, look for some of the issues, If you don't know what those are, I would just say pray. I kind of feel like, like if you believe in a higher power that, you will find what those are. But I think we all know, issues in our community, some of the social issues. And I think just start where you are, I think a really easy way to start is that a lot of people experience loneliness, people experience bullying, people experience, despite being on social media, a lot of people don't feel seen and heard. And I would just say, whatever those issues are in your community, start by building relationships with people, get alongside people. Join a club, join a church where you can meet people that are different from yourself, learn about other people. I think there's just really practical things that you can do. I think meet people that are different from you. That's a really good thing. And particularly in terms of if there's a particular issue that you want to do advocacy behind, meet more people from that community, test your fears, once you build a good relationship, ask them some of the questions that you've been too afraid to ask, help and contribute and serve. I think those are really, anyone can sort of do that. I know a lot of pastors like this. When I was a pastor, certainly I remember actually when I was a pastor in Australia, and I got a new assistant that had just come out of seminary, and he was a Samoan pastor and had come to work with me. So I was supervising him, and even though we were both Samoan pastors, we were at a community church in one of the most marginalised, deprived areas of Australia. It had Australia's highest domestic violence rate, highest rate of single parents, so a lot of single mums. So I did a lot of community work in that community. So I was preaching on the Saturdays, but doing lots of work and building lots of relationships during the week. Anyway, when the Samoan pastor came to work with me on the Saturday, we were in the kitchen and everyone was having lunch, and me and him are on the other side now, serving all the people their food while people came to get food. This community. And I said to him, and we joked, and I said, "Hey, I bet you weren't expecting this, right? Because when you're a Samoan pastor, you sit at the front table and people come and serve you, So anyway, that's all to say that it's a different type of leadership and we need to model ourselves so that people can see it. And I think it starts small, and it starts by serving, and it starts by helping, and it starts by relinquishing whatever privilege and power that you might have, no matter how small it is, even if it's that you get fed first and then you decide to feed last and that you help someone. I think those are all really cool ways to model leadership and to give and to help people feel valued and worthwhile and to listen. Sorry, I've been rambling, but I just...
All good. Super advice and recommendation. I think it can help people who may think like it takes big things, and sometimes it's just the smallest act of generosity that can trigger a bigger change. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
All
Absolutely.
Right. Well, thanks, Andre. Thank you very much for taking the time for this conversation. I think what you did in 2019 was an essential thing to do in the Pacific, and I hope it will trigger deeper conversations and meaningful change for every people, every identities. And thanks for sharing your ideas and your thoughts for this podcast today. All the best for the coming times, and Godspeed, as we say.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for sharing your platform, and I feel really privileged. And thanks for the great work that you and the organisation does as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.